Good morning, buenos días. Estamos aquí en Space. Estoy con mi amiga Michelle y nosotros tenemos un diálogo hoy, una conversation sobre amor. So,
Amor.
bienvenido.
Y gracias, Jacob. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí contigo y hablar contigo siempre es un placer, es un regalo.
Sí, definitivamente es pro. Y perdóname, mi audience. We will speak in English for this one. I'm not ready to spring an entirely Spanish dialogue on you yet, but it's coming. That was your preview.
Coming. Yeah, it's a little preview.
Coming soon. I've dealt with entire doctor's appointments and
Mhm.
long conversations in Spanish now, so it's going
You're
well.
amazing, Jacob. Like, you're incredible. You've learned so fast, so fast.
Thank
When
you.
you have to, right? Like when you force yourself. Like, I'm just gonna
Yes.
be here and speak Spanish. Yeah. But
Yes.
it's truly amazing. Like you're doing great. Like that's to your credit.
Gracias. See, it's one of my big goals for this year to, yeah, really master a second language. So, yeah,
Doing
devoted to
great.
the craft.
Yay.
Yeah. So I think today I want to speak about love in a philosophical sense
Mhm.
and some of the deeper questions that come up around relationship and really considering how does love fit into our sense making of life, our choice making, and how does it fit within the rest of philosophy? Because I've really noticed like I wrestle with these things a lot. And when I'm wrestling with them, I'm like, man, there's no guidance for this whatsoever. I mean, there's no guidebook for life, but
Mhm.
in this domain especially, it's not really clear that you can go and plug into some super dynamic conversations that give you insight to help you um, make sense of how does this fit together with living wisely? What does wise choice look like in this domain? And also how does it connect with faith as well? And I'm really interested to touch on that today. So that's sort of the landscape that inspired me to invite you for this call.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Jacob. An honor to be here. And yeah, I think you're quite right. I mean, I think generally you can see how sometimes people feel a frustration that like, oh, like what exactly does like philosophy have to do with my life? And I think that's unfortunate because that comes from kind of categorizing everything, right? Like it's like you have this subject and this subject and this subject. And I remember in school being feeling a deep sense of integration or desire to integrate and think about the subjects like this, right? And so I always thought like of wanting to do something more interdisciplinary, but it's almost like, why does there have to be almost like a subject called like an interdisciplinary study when these subjects are so related, um, in so many ways? But then again, the whole medium of school, like not to get into a whole conversation on that, because there's obviously a place for education in school and like formal institutions, but the whole medium was always kind of like, you go here and do your school, you go back to your life. So it's like I think I'm just trying to think about some of the origins of why this might exist in the first place. Why might it be that we have a hard time kind of understanding and seeing the value of something like philosophy and how it relates to our love lives or romance or love itself. um and I mean, I think for me personally, I remember just wanting to like trying to kind of be able to keep it something separate from what for me was my thought life. Like I don't know if one might be like, well, that's not philosophy, but I do think there is something that's more philosophical about um theology and religion, because it's asking those big questions about like, why are we here, why do we exist, what is love, what is love? I mean, that was my entry into philosophy, was through theology. So for me, sometimes I like just being able to think of them as separate so I could just do whatever I wanted, in like with when it came to relationships. But it really was taxing. It was very, I felt like I was fooling myself to think I didn't have to ask those big questions in conjunction to what I was wanting to do romantically and with other human beings' lives and my own heart and their heart, or their hearts, when it comes to other human beings. So yeah, I think it was like having to really realize that like these things you can't, for me at least, I was like, I can't just go on not being as thoughtful there, because it was costing, me and other people. And that's where I really had to sort of make a decision to kind of be like, I don't know if thoughtful is too lacking of a word, but for lack of a better word, thoughtful about it, more thoughtful about what am I really doing, And so, and then how are these things of what my own whims, desires, instinctual stuff, how is that related to those big existential questions of life? So I wanted to say all that.
Mm. Yeah, what comes out for me in that is that there is no education in this domain at all. It's real, well, we get some kind of pop culture education, and then it's really sort of up to you, and then possibly up to the conditioning of whatever notions of romance or love or relationships that you received from your primary models, from your parents or from people around you. Um, and that's further complicated by the fact that the landscape of values around all of that has undergone a rapid change, it seems, in the last 30, 40 years, especially as it relates to monogamy and polygamy and the kind of collapse of marriage across the Western world, by like literally 50%. So there's clearly actually a deep societal, cultural challenge somewhere in this domain. There's something murky that's not being addressed, that's not being made sense of. Potentially, people are actually entering into a received notion of marriage, but then it's not working out how they think, or that's now in conflict with another set of values, and it's not clear how to mediate those, or the basis on which people are connecting is kind of like cracking open and giving way to some deeper reality of relationship and who they are. And then they're like, well, I don't want to be in this. This isn't what I signed up for, kind of thing. Um, and that's kind of meaningful speculation for me. But I think um, to bring it back a little bit, just to like love itself, I've been reflecting on, to what extent love is a reflection of like cosmic choice. And when you choose in the domain of love, it does have the potential to alter the entire course of your life.
Yeah.
Um, and I wonder if we can actually sense that, we can feel that when we're making those, like making a love choice is somehow even more load bearing, even more significant than making a career choice or making a financial choice for the most part, because of the potential of a lifelong path opening up with a person. Like the fact that that's a possible space makes it so much more consequential than pretty much any other choice we make in life. Um, and yeah, of course, for a lot of people, it's not consequential because there is that back door, there is that exit. And to the extent that people are not, yeah, to the extent that people are not secure in that lifelong commitment, then that backdoor exit is always going to be slightly ajar as well. And I think we're definitely in a situation where that's more and more the case in the context of, you know, church church sanctified marriages, and marriages with big, beautiful, expensive weddings and all kinds of things. There's still that possibility open in culture. So there is some need for, yeah, a deeper thinking through what that is and why we choose it. And yeah, to what extent there's like a logic rationale to love. Is love rational? Is love irrational? Is love non-rational?
Mhm. Yeah. No, that was all really good, Jacob. And a lot of thoughts came to mind. I mean, I think that just to speak really quick to the irrational, rational and non-rational, Daniel and I will do a lot of work on the non-rational. And so I think it might get into a question of what does it mean? Because I would say that love typically falls into the rational or irrational. Like we think of it in terms of calculation of like, I like them, do they like me back? It's very in a sense like you're using your rational, like it's weird because it always feels like it's just the way it can feel phenomenologically if it's love and like if you're falling in love and it's so saturated and it's so all consuming. So in that way there might be like a complete irrationality to it, right? And this is what a lot of people think of love, where that's what they say, love is blind, right? It just which Lady Justice is blind. This can be a good thing, but you can also walk off the edge of a cliff because you're blinded, right? You're not looking where you're going. So there's a twofoldness to it being irrational for good and for bad. And then the same can be for rationality, right? Like you can have your senses, you can kind of have your head on straight in a certain way to be rational about love, because I do think there is a rational element. Like there is unrequited love and there is love that is that way. Or even we think about like, well, I'll put a pause on that for a second. There's the love that doesn't necessarily calculate, like I was saying, the irrational, but there is the love that calculates like, okay, I'm not going to keep like just allowing myself to have my heart and soul for this person. And they don't even like, they literally don't acknowledge my existence, or they don't even know that I'm like, they just have no feelings for me. They don't like me. So there's a point, right? Like it might go through the irrational stage, but eventually the rational catches up and it will be like, this is probably not the best use of your time. And so that's where, and I do think there are things that are very rational about love that we sometimes call like irrational, but it's very exchange based. Like what can I get out of it? How do I feel? How do they make me feel? How do I make them feel? And that makes me feel good. So there's all of that. I think there are rational calculations on that front as well. Now the space of the non-rational is where it gets kind of tricky, because the non-rational is basically kind of can be both be the rational and the irrational. And so maybe it would kind of, I do believe like love at its I want to say like its truest sense is non-rational, but then it's like, what does that actually mean? What does that actually like look like? I mean, I can't help but think about Christ and his love for humanity. It comes in this kind of strange victory death where it's like, it's like the love of God loves, it can potentially be an unrequited love forever, for eternity, where he loves and the person one doesn't acknowledge his existence and doesn't love him back, right? So I feel that God puts himself in the position of that irrational love. But at the same time, in a sense, there's something also, it also talks in scripture about like, something about like there's a foolishness in not believing that in God and in the creator, that there's somebody who made this earth that's not you. This is like in the Proverbs, in the proverbial wisdom, it will talk about this. So there's something kind of irrational about the human in that posture. So it's a little easier for me to think about it in terms of irrational. Well, if we think about Christ and the rational concept, there could be a way in which this would be where a lot of like that exchange language can come into, and this falls into sometimes what can be good. We obviously all do exchange all the time, even if we don't like some of the manifestations of it, and some of them are not good, right? Because they can be one-sided or greedy and all of that. But there is something about exchange that we need, and so sense there's like that the rational calculus of I give my life, thinking about Christ, because it's in the hands of the Father. And ultimately, in relinquishing his own life and allowing it, like, let this pass, like, it's a whole garden, when Jesus has that very poignant time by himself in the Garden of Gethsemane, in that sense of like, let this cup pass, but if not, like, I will still take this cup because it's yours. So it's the Father's will. So he does that, and that's a complete surrender. And yet in that surrender, he has this like sublation of his own life, right? He has his descension, but also his ascension. And there's this kind of radical, not only does he receive his life back, but he receives his reign with Father God forever, seated at the right hand of God. So it's like, there's this, so I guess what I mean to say is like, there's something kind of like he made a wager in a sense, like if we want to think about it in the rational sense of what this love meant, to surrender, and say, you know what, at like worst case scenario, I died and I did what God wanted me to do and I like lived out my purpose, or I die and have the potential for like this eternal existence with God. Now there's a lot there that can be poked at in terms of like Pascal's wager, and I don't want to necessarily go in that direction, but the point of the matter is there can be a kind of calculus there. Same for that, and maybe this is what does it, like the inversion. I talked about the irrational rational of God and the human, but the rational is, for Christ making this wager, and then maybe it is actually Pascal's wager for the human, where they're like, well, odds are like this might be the best wager I make, whether you agree with it or not, whether you think it's kind of a manipulative wager or not, it's still the type of wager that Pascal makes about it might be actually the best wager to believe that there is a God, to believe that that God exists. So anyways, now if we get into the space of the non-rational, that's the space where I think it comes into like what you were saying about the choice. Like, I think choice itself seems to be the non-rational, because it's like, it's not entirely not based on calculation, but it sort of makes this sort of wager at a time when you don't know. Like, we can calculate the rational by us knowing through the historical process, like Hegel will talk about. But when you don't know, that's when it's in the space of the non-rational, right? And so I think that's where choice comes in, and where this idea of like commitment comes in, and risk and all of that, not knowing what is going to occur. It's almost like the Good Friday type of, that's where the non-rational is. It's like, what? And this man saying he's God just died. He just died. He's dead. He's not even, it's just like, yeah, I thought he was crazy anyway. So there's like, I think that's where the non-rational really exists, in that weirdness, in that strangeness, and in that crazy, like that's just nuts. And, in a sense, you're like, everyone can kind of go back to their regular lives now, like, never mind about that kind of crazy, heretical, possibly demon man. So it's like, I think that, anyways, I just wanted to kind of just create the landscape of like the rational, irrational, and non-rational. But I do think that choice seems to be situated there. And I do wonder though, if like the very thing that makes this potential for non-rational, for love to kind of blossom forth as its fullest and truest form in the non-rational, is not also the thing that, like you said, leaves the back door open, right? Which again, like, some people are like, wow, they always say like hell is locked from the inside. Maybe that's what people think marriage, like, no, they're so committed to marriage, but it's hell-like. So are you really supposed to stay there? But maybe that staying there is a type of purgatory. Maybe it's not healthy because it's literally abusive. So there's a lot of kind of like questions to get into. But I do think this concept of a choice you can't go back from, like, and maybe you can never go back from any choice, but a choice that has a stake of your whole life, like I'm kind of trying to make the parallel back with Jesus, seems to be really crucial for love to be able to come forth, because it's kind of has that sustaining, it kind of gives that the situatedness. And one more thing I was going to say really quick on just thinking more about that analogy of the back door. Well, you can only have a back door if you have a house, right? Like an abode. And I do wonder if now, especially with the popularization, I don't know if it's popularization. There have been many times in human history where, there was polyamory. It's not like necessarily new. It's just that it's not necessarily the script that has been the Western concept of like what you do relationally for a while. And it's also, not only does it exist, but it might be more celebrated or spoken about as like a, this is a viable option. These are just one of your other options, right? But what I mean to say is like, the needing a roof over your head, to have a back door is a little different than your back door is like everywhere. Like there's not even there's no like there's no house. Like there's something about and it really depends on the particular situations. But a version of polyamory is not often situationally under the same roof for ever. Like that sustained living together with all the partners, not just mystery partners over here, here, and here, for a long time is I feel like it is a very I don't want to say like it could be a situation where that would really kind of bring to light that sort of sustained um, situation of the non-rational love that would then need to kind of come forth and unfold, and it's that sustainability of it that could potentially have a sort of litmus test by the roof. Because if you don't have to sustain it, then you can think it's being sustained, but you're not having to actually sustain it. Does that make any sense? So I'm just thinking about this analogy of like the back door, where today a lot of times we like to think of romance as in like, who needs the house? We're just gonna be out in the open. It's just like we'll just have like all of those options. And isn't it about choice anyway? So we've got like we're gonna just let choice go to the max. But the thing is that choice seems to need, it's almost like it hits a super saturation in that, where it becomes its opposite, right? Where like it's max choice becomes the opposite of that, which is like a kind of, now you're literally not, you've given yourself over to not having to how do I put this? It's almost like it could potentially be all instinct or all drive, right? Where it's not so much about choice, which seems to be in this place of it actually limiting. Choice seems to have to limit in order for it to also be an actual choice, like an actual choice with stakes that might risk your entire life or require your entire life or something like that. So anyway, that I have to get a little bit better in terms of my articulation of this, but I think it's interesting to have this idea of the back door, where we live in a time where we've lost a lot of the sense of like what the home is, and because people go to college and then they move and they don't have the roots where they grew up and all of that. And I'm not suggesting that like we need to necessarily return to that, but we may have a harder sense of understanding what it even means to have like a situated like something that has walls, right? Like Sam Willman, and I will talk a lot about this, she's an architect, where it's hard to even know the inside and outside space anymore. And so the idea of a back door, one might like it's there may be a new sort of mentality of like, back door, we don't even need doors, we don't even need houses, like, and I don't mean this like, I mean this metaphorically really, but there it is sort, it does seem to be linked to some structural things that have changed over time in terms of like our actual geolocational places and how people move a lot more because of airplanes, and that's all good and well. It's just that it sustaining things like can look different or maybe have a different meaning today. And I do think though that like historically speaking, polyamory sustained under the same roof, unless it's straight polygamy with a head man, it does usually is not just in terms of numbers, it usually is not what happens to be like the sustainable model. Not that it can't happen. It's just not as, it's not, doesn't seem to prove to be like historically speaking what ends up being like a model that like endures really. Because part of that reliance is, why do we even have back doors? Like what is the thing, what is the glue that keeps it together? And so but then again, like getting into the glue that, and I'll wrap it up now. I know I've said a lot, but like the glue that keeps it together always has a risk too, though, right? Because any types of givens can become totalitarian. However, I do believe that we are humans, and we do need givens as we need releases, like we'll talk about in our book Belonging Again. And like even language is a type of constraint. If we didn't use some sort of given of a language, sure, we can maybe speak in like Spanish and English, right? The more we learn, the more we could have like less limits on that. But you'd still have to limit yourself to a particular language to even be coherent and make sense and have some sort of ability to communicate with one another. So that was a lot, Jacob. Thanks for letting me go on my little tangent there.
Well, thank you. That was like 3 different terrains. So I'll try and address the pieces that came up in each of them, because that was,
Okay.
yeah, that was
Cool,
pretty
cool.
vast. Yeah. Um,
I'm just looking for a piece of paper.
oh, no worries. I think the first thing that came up for me is just the mythic quality to this that I initially wasn't feeling approaching this conversation, but as you were speaking, and particularly as you started to evoke the kind of biblical context of some of this, started to feel like, yeah, there is this mythic quality to man and woman and the relationship between man and woman and how this union has kind of just occurred again and again and again and again through time immemorial.
Yeah.
And that's a really significant backdrop that certainly in modern times seems to have been a little bit like rubbed away from the collective canvas, even though it seems like it has a kind of fundamentality to it, like it's just in the fabric of life. And then there's this question of Christological love, divine love, and how does that relate to romantic love and marital bonding?
Yeah.
The first thing I'll say is definitely a way in which the misinterpretation of this can be fatal. And there's a lot of young Christians out there in very unhealthy relational dynamics because of a misinterpretation of what it means to be Christly loving. And there's some sort of category error that can occur when you take um, the way that the Christ person being in relationship to God is loving of all things and all people and all of reality. And then you kind of apply that with all of the pain and attachments of romantic relationship, and basically what that produces is like rescuer dynamics and things of that nature, where like I'm gonna show you what true love is and this kind of thing. And yeah, you're basically your sacrificial love is actually blocking the possibility of a higher frequency, higher quality of love taking place. And yet there is still something about the Christ figure that seems important to this. And I think it's a metaphor or an allegory of being wedded to a path in life. Um, Probably most fundamentally being wedded to faith and the notion of yeah, living from that. Because when somebody comes into relationship with um God, there's this idea of yoking that you kind of you 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 yoke yourself to that relationship, to that principle, and there's a commitment to that that is um not just lifelong but eternal, right? So it's deeply fundamental, and when people sincerely undergo that kind of conversion process, they're not making a short-term change unless there's like some deep crisis of faith that occurs later in life. Basically, they're setting a relationship to the whole of life that they're going to abide by, and everything in their life is going to occur within the context of that. And so marriage, although it does have a pre-Christian context, it's in Judaism and other cultures. In the Christian context, marriage is directly in relation to that faith relationship, like the commitment to God, and then the commitment to the partner is somehow supposed to be in some sort of harmonic, allegorical, shared reality. And um, it seems quite likely that right now what we have is actually that those two principles have been separated as well. So this marriage is kind of floating over here, and then this kind of like faith, life, church, God commitment is floating over here. And of course, they don't make as much sense as they did when they were both bonded together, because they have this dynamic geometry, it seems to be. And that's reflected in how the marriage ceremony actually takes place. It's supposed to be, you, and the priest, kind of triangulating towards God, being before God. Um, okay. And then the wager that you talked about, this is really alive for me. So much of this podcast, so much of Culture Pilgrim has been about how do we move through a landscape filled with not knowing, filled with uncertainty,
Mhm.
with growing aliveness and skillfulness. And a lot of that is about tapping into intuition, non-rational ways of knowing as well as rational, and how to like get that navigation where I don't know how this works, but there's like a larger I that has some connection with a larger intelligence that knows this is the correct step, this is the right move to make. And that kind of brings us back to the faith thing. Is like, what are the, how do I conform myself to life? What am I being faithful to, that I can start to get to a place where I can make those steps into the unknown and those commitments in the unknown that don't collapse into like getting like the security of now I know, but still allow you to make an affirmative choice and a commitment. And ultimately, yeah, as you spoke to, like building a home in the world, building a house in the world, building a context, building a place, and what becomes possible when you do that. The most common answer to that would be children, which is creation. It's fostering the space for the creative force of life to move through you. There's also you know, it's a yoking, it's a sacrifice in its own way. Right? So just as
Mhm.
much as the artist is getting yoked and sacrificing their blood and sweat to fulfill whatever wants to come through them.
Yeah.
So what comes up for you in just reflecting all of that back?
Yeah. Wow, that was all really, really good. And I'm really glad you brought up children because it, okay, so let me put that, let me just pause there right quick. You were saying about this realm of faith over here, and here's marriage over here, right? And like I was saying, I mean, I think that a large part of that happened because um I mean, one answer could be potentially just that when it was like this, people saw problems or they experienced problems about this. And so they're like, let's just go ahead and separate those two things. And let's just get that one out the way. We'll just kind of keep this one. And um, uh, there's a real there's a real way in which I think of it almost more like the fact that love is, if we're talking about love on a romantic level with another human being, that you're giving like you're in, so it you can't actually like technically give somebody like your life, right? Because like I nobody even has their whole life. It's not like some little package you can just hand over to the other person, right? You don't know for how many days you'll live or what your life is, and so you don't, it is an uncertainty. I think that's why when marriage was connected with a lifelong promise to each other and commitment to each other, this was a way to both like be certain that you're going to do that, but be very uncertain about what that means, right? It's where it had the two really closely linked of certainty and uncertainty. Um, Now, I think that again, like I was saying about this package of like you can, but something you can give if we're talking about love is the sexual act, the sexual intimacy, which is the actual giving of something to another person inside, into them, really, if we're talking about the man-woman dynamic, because that's what we talked about, this mythos of the man and the woman, like that these two seem to have historically continued as a pairing, because that's how you also get propagation. That's how you get the species continuing. Like, this is just on a biological level, how we see species continue. And they face extinction if that reproduction is threatened in any way, and if their own lives are threatened as well. But if we're talking about something like standing the test of time, unless we're transhuman, then that would be happening biologically. This is just kind of like, if we think about Darwin and species, and survival of the fittest, the survival of those who keep having like this male female sex and have babies. So in this type of exchange, something is actually given, and there's the potential there for new life. So in a way, I think of something that could maybe be thought of in terms of the male-female love is that you can't necessarily you can give somebody your life in so much as you give them your life force, right? Like, life force is a big kind of understanding in some discussions these days that I hear of here and there in like the liminal spaces. But I think it's really a really important concept and understanding of what what is the life force, and how to in the sense of it being fully given to the other person, and how that has historically always meant the potential for new life, for actually conceiving and gestating and pregnancy and birth, and multiplication, like, in the sense love multiplies. And so I guess what I mean to say is there could be something potentially helpful about thinking about what does it mean to give your life to somebody, but to give that life force to someone consistently, daily, like on a very regular and sustained manner. In that way, your life is comprised of every little moment, every little day is what makes up the totality of your life in the long run. So I think about like how this seems to be really crucial, but also how this kind of connection is a type of very physical, right? But there's also something that's metaphysical about it, because it's a physical act, but it also has this very metaphysical bonding, like this kind of unity. It doesn't have to necessarily, but I think when it's really in its fullest form and in its love form, it has this unitive element, this sort of like, that's what love is, right? Because you can't go somewhere in the world and point to what love is, but you can point to examples and manifestations, but it's not like some type of thing you find in the forest. You're like, I found love, it's right here, right? So it's a metaphysical construct. It's a metaphysical existence and like force, I want to say. But it seems to be tied to this giving and I want to say exchange, because I do think there is good exchange of the life force itself, which then ends up being like this connection between love and in its metaphysicality, and a physical component that then makes it both physical and metaphysical, and makes it have this kind of eternal nature, right? Or something beyond you, because a child is, their life will, Lord willing, go beyond your life. Like they will continue. You will die someday, and we will all die someday. But in a sense, this is like this, it's generational because it's generative in its creative capacity, but it also creates generations, and it creates this something beyond your own lifespan, the future. This is, so there's something about that is very, to me, it's hard to think of love and marriage and sex as separate from the creative process of the metaphysical being. If we just want to say, people may not necessarily call that God, but there's a way in which the Godhead has a direct connection in that eternality, in that unitive, in that procreative and generative quality that manifests itself in what marriage is. Because marriage, it's like when you marry two things together in welding, it's literally binding. And religion is from that word religiar, which means to bind. So to me, it's very difficult for us to separate those things on a metaphysical and physical level, because they seem to be so similar in quality that if we try to separate them, or if we just don't understand, if we ascribe no metaphysicality to the physical commitment and act of sex, which has this longevity to it, then I'm not sure what sustains it. I don't know what sustains it. But this also has something to do with the fact that we've, for a large part, and it's been popularized since the 50s, but has existed for all of human history. But really, it's a lot more to get into in the history of this. But in the 1930s, but then the popularization of birth control and the pill has separated sex from procreation. So it's like, it kind of only follows that if sex was marriage essentially, because it welded the two people together, right? And this didn't always conceive a child, just because the woman's fertility cycle is only but 10 days, 5 to 10 days a month. But and then also people may experience infertility. This is why there was this concept that God opens and closes the womb, all of this, the historical figures and the mythos of that. Or it has this unnatural conception in Mary. But again, another topic. But the point of the matter is, marriage was sex essentially. So then if you have a type of physical act, but it doesn't have what I want to say is a pre-technological form kind of always associated with it, it becomes something that leans more on the side of certainty, right? We're going to do this, but we're going to be certain we're not going to conceive, because otherwise we're not going to do this, or I'm going to do this with somebody else, because I want to be sure that we're not going to have a baby, basically. Which I understand, I understand why certain lines of thought can think about why this could have generated, and also there's market forces which then make people feel tie a type of morality and responsibility to not having children, or a lot of children. I mean, and there's a lot of factors there. It's a much broader topic, but the main point is, again, sex and marriage. If we make sex something that's not necessarily, we kind of want to solidify that it's not going to be procreative until we want it to be, then that's kind of untethering it from its long metaphysical tradition. Okay, it only has the physical, but it even has a strangely changed physicality to it, where either let's just say with the pill, the woman is now making it so she's not fertile perpetually. So it's a type of physicality, but it's not the physicality that was its origin or its originality or something like that. And so then, it kind of only naturally follows that then marriage would have less to bind it, metaphysically and physically, because it has in terms of its structure as tied to this intimate act, which was both physical and metaphysical. Like I was saying, this potential creative, procreative, unitive act. It's a little bit less tied to that, and so it can fall into a new type of structure, which I guess still is metaphysical, of certainty. We're going to be very certain about it, which I guess becomes more of a little bit more of a rational calculus, which, like I said at the beginning, can be informed by the irrationality of I'm so in love is blind, I'll do anything for this person, right? So I think there's something about this type of God, marriage, sex thing that was here, and you get this with contraception, basically. Well, I mean, just that's I want to say, I'm not saying that's the only factor for that, because again, contraception has existed for lots of human history. There are other ways of doing it. It was usually riskier, a lot riskier, but it existed. Okay, but it became technological, and it became popularized, and it became almost moralized in some cases, and so you get this. And so of course, you just get this kind of floating, this kind of, just separation that continues on, I think, between this sort of, even though I think they're both oscillating like an infinity loop of the metaphysical and the physical, but it's you get this dialectic that then kind of spreads out, and the I don't know, a way that it can be reclaimed as understanding, and maybe building one's own metaphysical into that today, which maybe seems kind of Nietzschean, maybe choosing your own values, understanding what you and your partner decide is the metaphysical basis of that, which I think can be possible, definitely possible. but it depends on what that contract or whatever agreement is. It may not have the potential for the physical form that sort of embodies that the sustaining and procreative unitive act, as in children, right? It depends on that person. I'd have to think harder about like what substantiates a metaphysicality. That's a big topic, but like in this structure, that was kind of a given. It's kind of like this was a given, and this also did it. Like it again, it multiplied. It multiplied quite literally. And again, there's obvious risks for that, but the meaning
Mm.
of marriage was tied very heavily to this physical act, this physical exchange, and the potential and the uncertainty of it all. Given from the certainty of it being like, hey, this is a kind of union that mirrors the cosmic union of the cosmos and Earth, right? Or like God and his people, or something like this. Okay, then and over here, it's a little bit trickier to understand what that binding force is. What and again, I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm not saying people can't create it, but it's much more whenever you have to make a choice. Like this is why, again,
Mm.
choice has all these multifaceted dimensions. But again, like choice is existential. Like there's this book by Barry Schwartz, The Paradox of Choice, where it makes people very unsettled because they have to kind of make this sort of radical, again, like Daniel will talk about absolute choice. And then it can be like, is this the right one? Is anyone else doing it? Am I making the wrong choice? You get into all of that existential instability. Or maybe you make a choice to go back to this, like maybe more traditional or religious understandings of it. And then, you're wondering like, is that the right choice? Or like, am I just being too old school? Or, do people think I'm just kind of a fundamentalist? You know what I'm saying? So you have all these kind of concerns about what others might think in either situation. But that was a lot,
Right.
but it's just some things that came to mind.
That's excellent, Michelle. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I really feel the triadic bond in what you laid out, in which God, marriage, the physical bond, and then the
Mhm.
creation of children out of that. Like those, it's like a triadic bonding of the
Yes.
three, which has undergone a drift.
Yeah.
And that's so like, that's literally at the center of human experience. It's the center of your day-to-day life. If you're in a pair bond, and it's the center of the emergence of life. Um, it's the center of the home, and it's homes that constitute communities, which constitute the center of common life. So if there's a drift in all of those core things, there's a significant transformation and a change in all those things, we should expect that culturally things feel very different, and possibly there is a sense of drift that comes as a consequence of that. And it's not, as you say, it's not necessarily that the resolution of a sense of drift is a complete reversion to the things before, but there's some deeper consideration, mediation, and reflection on that. And I think there's still kind of um there's kind of an immature um lack of desire to reflect upon the condition, which is partly informed by feminist discourse. I feel like the beef with this patriarchal structuring of society and reality for much of history prior to recent times kind of has this effect of obscuring that,
Mm.
and not wanting to see that, or simply viewing what's occurred in the lens of progress. Um, so that really makes a lot of sense. To bring it back where I was before, like the profound choice involved
Yeah.
in love, and why does it feel so consequential? Why does it feel like often you have your life as reflected in society, and then you have your love life, and possibly your love life is of equal import or more significant import than everything else that's going on? How's my career going? How's my friendships going? How's my work going? So on and so forth. And this other thing that's not always reflected and mediated in those other areas can be of profound import, and it's because it's tied up. Like it seems that the roots of that are still tied to the things that you've spoken to, like the universe, the body, um, the metaphysical dimensions. All of those things are still at play. All of them still know that this choice is profoundly consequential.
Mhm.
And perhaps there's a way in which awareness of the consequentiality of the choice also increases the consequentiality of the choice insofar as you're just like la 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 and you have contraception and it's not, I'm not engaged in something serious, then you don't necessarily, you're kind of obscuring the connection to all of those more profound biological and spiritual dynamics that are at play. So, um, yeah, yeah, I'm really glad you brought in the physical and metaphysical combo there. I think
Yeah.
that the question that's still outstanding for me in this is something like in the matter of faith and living in accordance with a higher power, there is a point at which you may face junctures and choices in which it's something like what I want and what God wants, not the same thing
Mhm.
necessarily. And so much of the landscape of love and romance is characterized by what do I want? What are the things that I want? What's going to maximize my freedom? What's going to reduce my what I lose and sacrifice? What's going to be most in accordance with my preferences? In a myriad different dimensions. And that's part of the dating game and marriage game. That's part of the rational calculation that everybody makes when they are considering partnership. And yet, then there's this other matter of like, well, like it seems like walking in faith a lot of the time is kind of like I didn't choose this from like the me part. I was called to it from some larger me of which I'm a part of. And, for that reason, a missionary will get called to go and live in Africa in some, frontier community or something. It's not that they were like, yeah, this is the most in alignment with the totality of my preferences personally. Probably not. Probably prefer to be in some suburban paradise or something. But yeah, like how do we mediate those two in love? Because it seems like the mediation of that is the same question of like what is love? What am I participating with fundamentally here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a
No, that
big
was
question. You don't have to answer it in totality, but that's what's kind of still that's an unanswered question for me in this conversation.
yeah. No, that was really good. Um, so two or three things are coming to mind. I want to go back just a little bit. And I was talking about this idea of like creating a new metaphysical binding. Like I said, it's kind of Nietzschean, choosing your own values and like, writing them on your neck and all of this stuff. Like there's something about I the thing that was about sex that could create children is that it was so tied to that most intimate and vulnerable act of the love and the intimacy that then from that very place could potentially create a new life, like a whole new human being. But there is potential for that metaphysicality to come in what people are making together as like art, because I do like actually my project for Cadell's wonderful nature conference on Thus Spoke Zarathustra is how every creator is a mother, and you get this so deeply and speak on it so beautifully, Jacob, where there is the sense that the artist understands. They really do have a very unique position to understand the real, just very real quotidian physical things of pregnancy and birth and bringing things into being. So I think there is something about art and creativity that can potentially be a type of binding for people. But we live in an age where it's very consumeristic. So a lot of couples are, no, I mean, just we can all be this way, but it's on the whole maybe more consumeristic than they are creating and creators. Now, again, I think there's something a little bit more, like I said, substantial in the sense of it being like Aristotelian substance, where there is something of that substance in the actual most intimate act of the life force exchange that creates itself. Like that's, I think, pretty profound. But again, I think there can be something that can help couples in terms of keeping that sort of like metaphysical dimension of longevity and sustainability in what they're creating together, what they're building together and what they're creating together. But again, there can be a dynamic in couples where the person just has their job and the other person just has their job. And it's very hard to get that sense of what they're building with one another. And so yeah, I just wanted to speak to that really quickly. I do think there's that can be a potential metaphysical type of glue, if we want to say. Now, I don't, in terms of it being like, I mean, yeah, art will also, depending on what it is or what is being made, will always kind of stand some sort of test of time in the sense that it's been made and it's out there, right? Children have this interesting role of being what you made and what you didn't make, right? But that's a little bit like art too, right? That's a lot like art too in many respects. But there is something about them continuing on the human species, which is a little bit different than art, but art may reinfuse that desire to continue living and being a species and actually being human and being on Earth. So anyways, I was just thinking a little bit more about that. But I wanted to also say what you're talking about with the consequences. I think that's huge. I mean, look, I'll just say personally that, as maybe as basic as it sounds, for me, like understanding the consequences of having, like, potentially becoming a mother or having a baby, I wanted to be in the position where there is a man who had committed his whole life to me and was by my side. So I wasn't by myself, that it was by my side to do it, to be there with me through that. So for me, that meant like, waiting till marriage, and so like, and I had like, we talk about like the conditions and the types of things that you're kind of, I don't want to say programmed but there's a type of programming. We can't deny that. Like, it's just a part of human existence. We receive certain, input, and then that makes us have certain outputs in different ways. But, I remember my older sister being very formative. Like, it wasn't just stuff I was kind of getting like talked about, like at church or something. It was my older sister talking with me and my twin sister, just, having our girly time as sisters and on her bed, just talking through the meaning of sex and how powerful it is and how important it is. And so, and also I remember her saying, like, we weren't allowed to date until we were 16. That was my parents' rule. But she was also like, you may not necessarily need to date in college even, because like just through her own experiences, she's like, it can be really like, there could be a lot that's difficult about that and makes you focus more on your, men than like your studies and all of this stuff. I ended up like dating in college. But the point of the matter is that her talking through her own experiences and her own kind of things she had come to of her own understanding was really powerful for me, because it really, she's somebody who, I love and admired, and was like, she's one of the most beautiful people. And so I just, that was something that made me attracted to the understanding. I mean, sure, it did come from the theology too, and hearing things and reading the Bible and, certain like, sermons or youth group talks or whatever. But there was something about that being one of the most like viscerally memorable things, was just sitting with my sisters on, and sitting with my older sister, with my twin sister on the bed and talking through the power of sex and why it's something that's precious and something that also does have consequences, and why you want to make sure to put yourself in a position where you're not just like very vulnerable to not being supported through that and in that. And,
Sorry, I just got
sure,
to
like,
interject. That is a conversation I did not receive during my teenage years. Apart from one driving to a house party when I was 16, in which my dad gave me a brief talk about not taking advantage of anybody, which was absolutely unhelpful because I never had the confidence to even kiss anybody at that stage. So there you go. It's important to have those conversations, but please continue.
no, thank you for adding that. Yeah, and this is the thing. Like, I understand that everybody's very personal experience with that topic and being young and coming into their self and their sexuality is so particular and so different. I'm just sharing from my own experience with it and how much that it was something of seeing something beautiful and precious and consequential. That's why I really bring it up, because you said about consequences, and understanding that there are those consequences means you take it seriously. It's like you don't just play around. It is playful, but you don't just play around. Just like you don't just play with fire, though you use fire and you enjoy fire, right? It's got to be on a wick. It's got to be in the hearth. It needs a place. And so, it's all fun and games until, like, you're burning, and then you're like, and I'm burning somebody else. And, like, I think that's understanding its power is vital. But sometimes that perspective can be seen as merely repressive, right? Merely avoidant in a bad way. Like, you're just not trying to ever get hurt. Well, I mean, yeah, like, I think there in some ways it's also not trying to hurt other people, though, because it will involve their body and their heart and their mind. And we can just make it pure physicality. But for me, it never could be that. I always loved, like, the flirtation and then all of that, the connection and the lighting up of the person. That was always so fundamental, and loving, like, just the being that is that person, not just their body, but their being that informs their body as well. So the consequential is important because we may not know how to comport ourselves regarding that if we don't know that you drop the ball and it falls, right? You slam the door on your hand, your fingers are going to really hurt. It's like being able to just slam the door constantly and your fingers, if you've made it so your fingers can't feel that pain, you're still breaking your fingers but you can't feel it. You can't necessarily feel it. That's not the best analogy, because I that would get into a whole lot of having to be fleshed out in terms of feelings and what is removing or at least lessening or nearly removing the consequences, what that actually does in that analogy. So forgive me for that. Not like fleshing it out here fully now. I'll think about it later, but and hopefully flesh it out a little bit better. But the main point is that consequences, especially very natural consequences, are important. I think as much as we like to just say, like, well, let's just not have those, or we don't need those anymore. And maybe it can work fine for some people, but it can also lead to a lot of, like, lack of orientation toward what that actually is. I do think that as human beings, there seems to be something of order that's necessary, for us to not be completely mentally unstable or have this kind of instability that is very consuming. Because I think about myself when I was in kind of like, when I just sort of didn't want to pay attention to the consequences, not merely sexually, but just relationally. It was very consuming. Like, it was very consuming on my heart and mind, and it just took up a lot of like time, energy, to use David McCarker's language from Theory Underground. It's like it takes up a lot of it's very, and I don't know, maybe it's just because of who I am as a person, or being female, or being, like, more emotionally high or whatever. It's like it was very I want to say it was difficult for me to have the fire outside of the hearth or the wick. And it's, and again, I don't know, again, if that's just me, but I do think that we have to kind of understand those consequences that we've sort of believed to be untethered now from the act or from what it is. If we don't acknowledge those at all, we don't know what we're doing, really. Like, we don't know what we're trying to orient ourselves with, and how do we have a sense of like proper decorum or proper engagement with this if we don't even if we've kind of robbed it of of what it is at its core or its essence, like fire, it's heat, it's hot, it, and yet like I was looking at a flame the other day and it's like this is magic. It's like it's so wild to me because it's like this little, it's just this little flame and it's almost invisible, but it's kind of there. But I'm like, if I put my finger in that, I'm gonna get burned. It's wild. It's magical. And I think that like for me, I do appreciate nature because it always will teach us things that are very, very important and that we can't overlook. Unless again you want to go in the, if you want to become transhuman or you would like to do some sort of like modification or augmentation of nature, there's room for that discussion. But if we're in the human, fleshly realm that we at least are in at this time, then I think it's important to pay attention to like what is as it is in its origin, our bodies and the nature itself, that then can help us keep a better sense of the consequences, the realities, the repercussions of things that are just around us, and that we are ourselves in our own bodies.
Mm.
So yeah.
Mm. What that kind of sparked for me was like it didn't address directly the question, but somehow in listening to it, it started to answer some of the question for me, which was
You're
like,
like, you didn't answer the question at all, girl. That's okay.
um,
Well, I hope it's okay with you.
well, it's that dynamic of um it's the dynamic tension we were talking before about tension between choosing
Mm-hmm.
and in a sense being chosen,
Mm-hmm.
or like this was meant to be, or like there's a place in which it's just like I'm in it, it is without question.
Yeah.
And then there's this other thing which is like more of like the free choice kind of part of self. And
Yeah.
there's a balancing between the two of those, right? And I think I've been in relationships where I've had a lot of the free choice voice and some love, but not the like the
Mm.
givenness of the commitment, or I've had
Yeah.
givenness of commitment, but I haven't been in touch with the free choice part. And it
Mm.
seems like if you have just the givenness and you don't have that like sense like, and this is also where the sacrifice and the consequentiality of choice kind of energy comes in. It seems like this part actually feeds this part
Mm.
in
Mm-hmm.
some respect. And
Yeah.
so the same thing that has the potential to always threaten the possibility of partnership and monogamy, I think possibly particularly from men looking historically, um, especially in Mexico, there's a whole history of this. But basically that impulse in a man that's like always looking over the hedges or looking for the other thing or thinking, well, I have this, but I could have the freedom or that kind of runaway impulse or what have you. Um, First of all, I've learned that's not a personal character defect. As far as I can tell, that's more like a fundamental nature of man that has to be contended with. It's
Mm.
more of a fundamental moral balancing. But secondly, what I'm starting to think into is that has to be sublimated. It can't be done away with. And
Mm.
the very fact that it can't be done away with actually gives more, there's a way in which that can give more life to this because
Mm.
in the commitment to it, there remains choice. Just in the same respect that even when you've like yoked yourself to God or yoked yourself to your faith, there's still this space of like turning towards that, turning away from it,
Mm.
knowing that you could go and do the thing that's kind of like more sin or moving away or moving towards. And like that dynamic of free choice remains throughout and actually animates the more of the kind of submissive devotion and yoking and all of that.
Yeah, no, that was really good. Yeah, and I think that in a way, a choice is never just a choice. Javier Rivera will talk a lot about this in some work he had written about on choice, and just the idea that like choice always opens up more choices, right? Like it is never just one singular. It is in a sense a type of singular choice, but now that choice opens up having to choose every day again. Like it doesn't sustain itself on its own in the sense of it's a choice you made and now it's just, I think that's the risk with like some of the kind of substitutional atonement where it's like, you got your ticket, you're done, right? Well, it's like, well, what about the sanctification? What about the choosing? The choice meant that now you have to choose every single day to remain with what you've chosen, with who you've chosen. And the fact that there's like ooh shiny over here is
Right.
actually a testament to what it means that you make that choice every day. If that wasn't over here, would this even be like really meaningful? Like it was chosen out of all that could be chosen and could be chosen at any moment. And yet it's still it's a choice that's made every single day. And I think that's what makes it very, profoundly meaningful. And, in a sense, it also requires something. I mean, it's sort of like that choice almost has to be reinformed by what is beyond just that choice or just beyond you and the other person, because it almost has like, I guess I'm trying to think of this interesting place of like, when somebody chooses, like in the faith sense, if they yoke themselves, right, to the will of God, okay, there's a way in which there's that's a type of faith, of leap of faith, right? But I'm trying to think of almost like heaven's leap toward you. Like there's almost something where your leap of faith also requires, I don't want to say requires, because I'm not sure if theologically you could say like necessitates heaven to do anything, but it's almost like in creating humans themselves and in creating especially the man God of Christ, there was a type of limiting that God put upon himself, right, for the sake of intervening or convening with humans and human beings. And so and so I think there's something about like it can seem so sort of like blindly dogmatic in that type of yoking of God's will. But I think that's when we forget it's a dialectic of, like you said, like there's like this constant possibility of just take off the yoke. Like it's not like it's not like it's that's the interesting thing about it. It's like there is the choice of it being a kind of part of you now, right? But there's a way in which and in a sense it can never leave you, because in the space of like your own mind and heart and memory, it's always with you. But there's a sense in which it's you still always do have that choice, and so it's like it has to kind of be but there's also the way in which for it to be a choice, it has to be faithfully present to you. Does that make sense? So it's like there's something about like it being a leap of heaven to even be a present kind of faithful presence to you, for you to be able to have a faithful presence with it. So I just wanted to say that too, because I think there can be this sort of like there it's interesting. I think there's a lot to kind of get into with I mean there's a whole lot that could be gotten into in terms of God's will, but for me I think what can be helpful in terms of opening it up to it not being this kind of like the risk of like a sort of dogmatic, like just you don't see anything else in the world. It's like, no, you do see, but you still choose. And that's the whole point. It might actually start to elevate you to a place where you desire higher things than you once did, but you're not blind to it. You see it, but you just your sight is set on something higher or different or more sublated or something like this. And so oh my gosh, I was going to say something else that was important, but oh well, hopefully it'll come back to my mind. But yeah, I think that that sense of the faithful presence is there, and yeah, it makes it in some ways much more. Oh, great, that's what I was going to say. Sorry, I'm glad I remembered. for me, the sense of God's will and doing God's will is a type of unfolding of a story that is like cosmically being written, and you're writing it with the author. Like you're being a co-author to this story that's unfolding. And yes, there may be in some ways, especially if we think about it in terms of like religiously, there are certain things that maybe are binding principles that seem like not as open. But it seems like you do have to have an actual sheet of paper and a pen that to be able to write that story. So some of those things might be those kind of boundary, or like, it's like a garden needs a particular plot in order for you to cultivate it as such, to bear the vegetables, to bear the flowers, to bear the fruits of it. So I think we need to think about that dialectic that way, where there's like, again, there's the parameters, but there's also the complete abundance and the unknown, the unknown that can come forth from in that, which is so beautiful. So yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely, Michelle. Like the image that came for me is it's like it's the hand reaching the other hand.
Yeah. Love
and
that.
From a perspective that's not connected to God, then that can just seem like reaching out a hand. But it's actually in the experience of the leap of faith that,
Yeah.
It's the experience of grace. It's the experience of kind of leaping and then landing in a profound and deeper relationality, or actually like, experiencing direct gifts in your life, or more foundationally experiencing what's already in your life in a very different way. And so marriage and divinely informed romantic love should bear the same quality, that there's a leap and then there's kind of gifts that you can't expect. And the last piece I wanted to bring here is just another way in which this is really analogous, is the way in which you choose your relationship is very similar to choosing your life. It's that same, all of those same dynamics of comparison are at play, of like looking out. You can easily look at other people's lives, other people's trajectories in a way that is undermining to your own, or it's comparative without context. But there's this place of affirmatively choosing the path that you are on, and it's from that place of being in faithfulness to that then becomes the most expansive, most true true path that you could be walking. So
Yeah.
thank you, Michelle, for helping me think through all of these topics: love, marriage, choice, faith.
Oh yeah. No, the pleasure is all mine, Jacob. Thank you so much for your time. It's a ripe topic, and I've a lot now that I've been left to think with, and I'm excited about that. So thank you for always giving me more to think about, and yeah, for just elucidating and illuminating so many insights yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you.